Our fourth presentation today is Dr. Roy S. Godson. Dr. Godson is Professor of Government Emeritus at Georgetown University and a former president of the National Strategy Information Center. He has pioneered curricula development and teaching to counter crime and in support of the rule of law in public schools and other sectors. He is the clear leader internationally in this effort. Dr. Godson will address education against crime, fostering culture supportive of the rule of law. Dr. Godson.
Thank you very much, John Norton-Moore and the team that you assembled to be able to take advantage of the opportunity of the presidential debates. I would like to sort of begin by talking a little bit about the national problem that I think we have with regard to crime, and then go a little bit into the reasons why we may have this particular national problem at this stage of our history. And then finally turn to what can be done to minimize the conditions that may be leading to the national problem, and concluding with some of the things that a president and other sectors of the government and of the society could do to ameliorate this national problem. Of course, the problem of crime is not new. We have had this problem for actually ever since we began as a country and even before. The problem of crime, though, is not limited to any social class. We tend to have defined the problem as particularly applying to some elements of a society and not others. No social class, no religion, no race, and no profession is immune to the problem of criminality. The problem affects us all materially, and people are well aware of the costs of crime, but it's interesting that it's very hard to come across total statistics of the effects of crime on the victims of crime in the United States. Even coming up with a victimology becomes a problem. When we talk about crime here, we're talking about all forms of crime, not just violent crime, but of nonviolent crime. And the statistics here do not help us very much in this regard, but we know that we have a major problem with nonviolent crime. It affects particularly the upper and middle classes of our society. Well, sometimes violent crime affects other elements of the society. But when we talk about this national problem, we're talking about the entirety of the crime issue. Not only do we have the material costs, which which are approximately around several 100,000 people a year being the victims of crime, and maybe more. And if you put this all together, it may be much higher than we know at the moment. But it also affects the quality of life, the insecurity, and the money and that we have to pay to reduce and manage the crime problem that we have. Now, why do we have this problem? Why has the crime prevention strategy that we've adopted for many decades now been so ineffective in reducing our crime problem? A great deal of writing about this and thinking about it focuses on police effectiveness, that the police have not been able to keep up with the causation of crime in the society, and that efforts should be made to improve the quality of policing. And there are various theories about the fact that we've been successful in some parts of the country and not others, and then why has this success then come about. And there is some emphasis now on trying to identify best practices, and some useful work has been done in this area. Another explanation of the causal reasons for the crime problem is socioeconomic conditions. The argument is that we have particular conditions that cause crime, and particularly violent crime, in certain parts of the society. And this is a major reason that we have to change our socioeconomic policy in the country to address the problem of jobs, the problem of racial discrimination, the problems of various kinds of people being unable to participate in the society. And this has been a cause of the problem. Again, a lot of work has been done to try to address this issue. There's some evidence to support the proposition that certain socioeconomic conditions are more or less likely to lead to crime, and to identify those conditions and try to address the problem of crime through affecting the socioeconomic conditions. Now, affecting socioeconomic conditions is a major undertaking, and it's a very expensive proposition, but people argue that this is an important thing to do. But almost all the effort and focus on socioeconomic is focused on really on the violent end of the crime, problem. It's focused on one particular area of the crime problem. It does not address the fact that many people who are middle and upper class and even very rich engage in criminal activity. It's called white-collar crime, or crime that we can't identify very easily. But now I think there's a fair amount of evidence to indicate that we have, for example, a major problem with corruption in American society. Corruption at various levels of society, including amongst government officials and including amongst those who are responsible for actually preventing and dealing with crime. I'm talking about law enforcement and other public servants who are we are pretty sure, involved in criminal activity, but not at the violent end of the spectrum. So these have been the two major ways we've looked at crime prevention, particularly looking at improving police performance, and secondly, the socioeconomic approach. What we have not seen much emphasis is on what I'll call the cultural approach, that the problem that has sort of festered for many, many decades, but has grown increasingly problematical in recent decades, is a culture that is not supportive of the rule of law. People don't really believe in it, or they don't believe in it as a whole, or they don't believe in it as a part. And so therefore they feel free and able to engage in criminal activity. We have to understand, I think, that there are two kinds of belief systems that are at work in American society. One are people who really don't believe in the rule of law. They've never had a good experience with the law as they understand it. No one has explained to them the benefits of the rule of law. And what they've observed in society, they think makes them believe that basically the rule of law is a fiction. It's a nominal way, it's a narrative that people who control the society use to control other people in the society as well. So we have a generation of youngsters who have grown up in some parts of the country that basically don't believe the rule of law is in their interest. Not just a part of it, they just think the whole system is rotten, and therefore, although they go along with it sometimes because they don't sort of want to challenge it all the time, they basically don't believe in the rule of law. And you can understand why some people who have been involved in the society would be inclined to have that reason. No one has taught them the benefits of the rule of law. They haven't found it at home. Their parents may have been in prison or have been subject to the rule of law in a way that was detrimental to their family. And nobody's actually taught them about the rule of law. There's nothing in their school. There's nothing in their community that really bolsters their understanding of and the advantages that they could see in the rule of law. That's a problem. That's one part of our cultural problem, and that we will come to sort of to having to address. But there is a second part of our society that is also problematic, and that is those who basically believe in the rule of law, but they don't think it applies to them when they don't want to use it. So they'll basically say They agreed there should be speed limitations on the roads. There basically should be a tax system. There should basically be rules about driving when drunk. I mean, a whole variety of laws that they'll agree to in general. But when it's in their specific interest on a specific time to follow the rule of law, they have rationalizations of why really it doesn't apply to them in that circumstance. So it's okay for them to drink before they drive. It's okay for them to speed on the highways. It's okay for them to cheat in schools on their exams. It's okay for them to follow the law when it's useful to them, but it's not very good when they don't want to find it useful. They also believe that the government should be following the rules more, and they focus on the government, but rarely focus on themselves. And so it is this group, which I would argue is probably predominant, although there are enough pockets of what I'll call the gangster element, that is, say, people who don't believe in the rule of law. But that is a problem, but I would say with the bigger half of the problem are people from all classes in the society, in all parts of the country, and from the different categories and sectional interests in the country, that don't really believe the rule of law applies to them when they find it in their interest to ignore it. Now, what can be done to affect this culture? We haven't very many tools, but we do have some which can be used to address this. One of the most important, I would argue, is school-based education. That is to say, children, many of them grow up without having one or both parents at home, and they don't have very many opportunities to discuss these issues with their parents. Where there is parental influence is probably the single most important factor, but we have large elements of our society where there either isn't one or both parents, and even if there are both there, there's not a lot of time in the day for the parents to be able to address these kinds of issues. And some of their parents already don't believe in the rule of law, or also believe in the rule of law that doesn't apply to them when they do this. So parents are one element, but parents are problematic in our society now. So that leaves what else is in the society? Well, I'd say the most important element that we can get hold of fairly easily at low cost are our school systems. We have elaborate school systems in the United States for elementary level, for junior high, and for high school. And we have rarely thought about using them to deal with this particular problem and the crime problem in general and the particular cultural aspect of the problem that I have suggested. Now, it may sound simplistic. It may sound easy to be able to do this. But to be able to use schools to actually influence the culture and get the culture to be supportive of the rule of law, we would have to have committed school systems, and we would have to have prepared teachers. Without the two commitments of the school system to be able to do this, and the second part, preparing and willing to commit hours and preparation of teachers to be able to teach these subjects, it will not be able to make a significant dent in school-based education or in the culture of lawfulness. By committed, I mean that the school leadership, school superintendents, have to agree that they will prepare their teachers and will commit classroom time to this subject. By preparing teachers, I'm talking about approximately just 1 or 2 weeks of the teacher's time. We've had enough experimentation with this kind of an approach in different countries, and including the United States. So it doesn't take very long to prepare a teacher if the teacher's supervisors agree that that's what they should be doing. With regard to the time in classroom, it only takes really about 20 to 40 hours of class time. It's minimal. One could do this for more, but without the commitment of at least 20 to 40 hours, you can't expect a child to absorb this kind of a level of understanding, of reasoning, that would be necessary to make some effect on their understanding and then their behavior. But if you can in fact get the school system, the people who control the school systems, to see that this can be effective, and are willing to make the commitment of teacher's time and time in the curriculum to this specific subject, then you can make a difference. You can start with elementary school, but actually little children are easily led in a good direction or a bad direction, and they'll follow along pretty easily. The really hard part of this is getting at children at the junior high school level, just as at the period of adolescence beginning, and when children haven't made a commitment one way or another on these issues. Then one can start to talk to them about the issues. Now, this isn't just a matter of preaching to them and just saying no to drugs or to crime or to antisocial behavior. This is a matter of explaining the reasoning behind this idea and the advantages of following up with the rule of law principles and why they should make decisions in a particular way. It also involves teaching them skills. They not only have to know something about the substance of the law and the rule of law, but they also have to have the skills to be able to apply those principles in the very particular circumstances they're going to live in. So they have to actually, you actually have to take them through the scenarios that they are likely to already be living in, but they haven't yet made their commitments. I'm talking about, for example, take the issue of drugs. It's not a question of just telling them about the bad qualities of drugs. They probably already know that. Now children at 10, 11 will know this, that drugs are bad for you, but sometimes it's okay to try it out and so on. They'll know there are some downsides to it. But one has to discuss also the advantages of not using drugs and not having people are selling drugs and being armed and controlling the neighborhood and so on, the whole syndrome that's involved in drug trafficking. Now, when you do this with children, they actually like it. They like to discuss it. They like to discuss the temptation. They like to discuss the scenarios that they live with. And they enjoy this kind of conversation. And most of the teachers that have taught this kind of subject find that they can get the students' interest in these kinds of problems. In fact, what happens is the children will start to bring problems to the teacher and bring problems to the discussion. And some of these problems are tricky. And you need teachers to be prepared to be able to teach these kinds of cases and scenarios and handle them particularly well. It can be done in a few weeks of teacher preparation. But to give an example, some of the children will come in and want to talk about domestic abuse. They'll start to talk about how their father treats their mother, or how their father may touch them and become involved with them in a way that they're very uncomfortable with, and they don't know how to deal with this. And so they'll bring these kinds of problems to the teacher, and then the teacher has to know how to deal with this. The teacher is not going to be the police. The teacher is not the one who's going to go to the police for the child and so on. But the teacher ideally would have a counselor in the school, as somebody who's there's an office and a vehicle inside the school system to be able to deal with those kinds of problems. Most of the problems are going to be the regular temptations that all children have to illegality, drugs, acquiring goods that have been pilfered or stolen, opportunities to get involved in sort of hijinks in the community, and sometimes, of course, drinking and driving and other kinds of issues. But having this discussion with the children usually is almost the first and maybe the only time you'll have a chance to discuss this with a child before they've made the commitments that they may make under the pressure of peers or the attractiveness that they think they will find in a more criminal undertaking. So the preparation of the teacher becomes very important, the way that teachers handle this, and similarly, the ongoing commitment of the school system, first starting maybe in the elementary level, but secondly in the junior high, and then particularly in the high school when they've already had this introduced to them before, you get into complex scenario building and complex moral and legal dilemmas. How do you deal with some of these moral dilemmas when you're confronted with it? When the child, for example, first learns about corruption. They've seen corruption often. They've seen people exchange goods for favors. They have some idea about it, but they really don't have much of an idea until they get into a situation where they have to decide, do they give or take a bribe? And you can sort of have this kind of discussion with them about it, the pros and cons of getting involved, the slippery slope of crime and corruption, how you start with a little and then it gets a little bit more and a little bit more, and how you get committed to it, and then the problem of getting out. And they love to discuss this as they see, and you can show them films like Goodfellas that they love to watch and discuss these issues, and there are a lot of other more positive films as well. But the point is, they've heard about it, they've either seen it in film or they've heard about it, and they welcome a chance to talk about it, and it is possible to influence them on these issues. You won't be able to reach all. There will be always 20% in class that are going to be very sympathetic to the rule of law, and there's going to be 20% in class that's going to be opposed to it. And mostly on the opposition side will be boys who are sort of asserting themselves in these circumstances. But you'll get a group in the middle there, and you can make a difference. And we have seen where there have been studies of pre and post testing of children who have been exposed to this kind of rule of law classroom education, and it has made a difference. Now, what is it that the president of the next president of the United States can do about this? Let me begin with what he shouldn't or can't do about it. He cannot control the curriculum of the school systems in the United States. We have many impediments and checks and balances to be able to limit the president's ability to do this. What we're not saying here is that the president of the United States should go around providing a national curriculum for everybody to use. That's not the issue. What we are saying, I'll come to what we are saying. We're also saying the president is not responsible for teaching education in the United States. He's not the responsible person for doing that. And we have other vehicles for teacher education, but the question will come whether anybody should include rule of law education about a culture of lawfulness into the equation. So the president has there are limitations on what the president should be doing. But what the president can do is raise the salience of this issue, to raise the salience that the culture that we're bringing to our children needs to be improved, to be reinforced in a particular direction. And he can can recommend a national conversation about this. He can make this issue into something that would be important to the country. If he does that, and he has some effect there, I think then you will start to see is our school systems, which are so decentralized that it is very difficult to bring them together on many issues, that the school systems then will start to consider this issue in a way that they have not so far. If I hadn't seen this operate effectively in some places in the world, you would say this is idealistic and unrealistic to use this vehicle of school-based education. But we have seen examples in societies that were much more difficult to affect and to change the culture in places which were much poorer, where the socioeconomic conditions were not as favorable, and which the police were not terribly effective in, if not counterproductive, on this subject. And that is in unusual places, such as Hong Kong, southern Italy, in Colombia even recently. There have been major changes in these cities. People used to think Hong Kong was a place where there was a lot of corruption and so on. 20 or 30 years ago, that was the case. Organized crime was very important in Hong Kong for various reasons. And people believed that it was impossible to make a change. But Hong Kong has changed for the better. And one of the reasons is much more a cultural influence that is much more supportive of the rule of law and against corruption and organized crime. There's still a problem, but it's changed a lot. And changing the culture was one of the most important reasons for this change. And the same is true in Sicily. Yes, there is still a mafia, but the mafia does not have control of the minds of the people in Sicily anymore. They know there are alternative ways. And there's sort of a battle still, it's not finished. But the change in the culture that came about in the early part of the 21st century was part of this, and school-based education was part of that cultural change. Columbia. Columbia is not the same as it was 10 and 20 years ago. We had almost given up hope for Columbia, but the Colombians themselves decided to make a change, and we, the United States, have helped it. But one of the changes is in the culture. You can now go to Medellin and have a good vacation and not be fearful. Yes, Medellin has problems like any major city in the world, but Medellin has changed. Cali's changed, and of course Bogota has changed. And a significant part of this was a change in the mind of people and their attitudes, and of children who started to grow up with some of this kind of education in their school system. Right now, there is a battle for the minds of the children in Mexico. They've actually begun to use these kinds of techniques, but it's just the beginning. And there was a debate about it, and some people say, no, we have to have better police. And some people say, no, it's the media's fault. And some say, yes, it is the minds of children in school. Now, you do need to have the police be sympathetic to this. You can't expect the children in school to believe that they shouldn't engage in various illegal activities if they see that the police are doing that, if they see the law enforcement are doing that, and they see their parents are doing that, and they see it on the television as being a basically favorable thing to do, then it's much more difficult to change the culture. You want the police to be a good role model in the society, and usually they're going to go somewhat together. And the examples that we've seen. We've seen that the media can play a role too. You can't just rely on school-based education. You have to have reinforcement. And so the media can play a role, not just in investigating bad behavior, but in promoting good behavior and talking about the heroes that have been able to both counter the criminal elements, but also the heroes in their everyday life who follow the rule of law and have led successful families. And they sort of contrast that with those who get involved in organized crime, and they may have a short, sweet existence for a while, but sooner or later they're going to tumble down, and their family structure is going to be affected by it. So where you can get school-based education and you can get the police on track with this, and you get the media being sympathetic, and other sectors, if one can reach other sectors at the same time to do that, you can see that this has made a major difference. So the bottom line of all of this is that it takes some time. It's not expensive. It's not terribly controversial to talk about teaching this in schools and preparing teachers and using a little school time. After all, we have had changes, cultural changes in America before. Once upon a time, people thought slavery was basically okay, but gradually they came to change. They thought the role of women also needed to change. They think there needs to be environmental education so people understand that. So it takes a while for cultural processes to take part, to come to fruition, but we have been able to do it before. Others are doing this in more difficult circumstances. So I think there's good reason to believe we can do this, but it will require leadership from the top down to help make this a salient issue in the future. Thank you very much.
Dr. Godson, thank you very much for your leadership in this area, and something terribly important in trying basically to get into the mind of individuals before they make a decision for a lifetime of crime. Are there any questions for Dr. Godson? Yes.
You mentioned that there had been some examples where this had been tried in the United States. You alluded to them at least. Do we have any anecdotal evidence that would talk about what are some of the major impediments that need to be overcome? I mean, it would seem to me, some would argue, that our teachers are already overworked. They have to deal with issues of crowded classrooms and not enough resources available to them. Is that the major impediment, or what is the issue that's the hardest to deal with at the local level in order to be able to have this type of education?
First would be that the local leadership believes it is necessary to make a change. And so if you don't have school superintendents who believe in it, then they will not look for opportunities in the school system. We're not saying that math and English and the humanities aren't important, but we're saying that to have a good society, our founders told us that we would have to have a virtuous society, and that to have a virtuous society, you needed education. And you can't expect children or teachers or adults to understand what's involved in the rule of law unless they have someone to explain this, someone to guide them in developing this. And once you have these habits embedded in the culture, then you can expect them to continue. And we have been reasonably successful in American history of embedding this culture into American society. But as we have seen in recent decades, we haven't gone far enough. We haven't been able to reproduce this virtuous cycle inside American society. So it really requires almost a paradigm shift, if I could use that term, that people have to believe that we have to include this. And this subject is almost as important as math. The good news here, it's nowhere near as difficult. And there's good reason to believe that we will be able to replicate this virtuous circle once again.
I've long believed that people pursue their perceived self-interest. Is any effort being made to focus this on self-interest, on a sense of honor, a sense of pride, self-respect, that if you lie, cheat, and steal, you will not be as proud of yourself, as happy with yourself? Even if you're able to deceive others, you will know that you lied, cheated, or stole, and thus you will have less honor, you will be less value as a person, and so forth.
Yes, I alluded to that very fast when I said we talked about different levels of education. So with very young children, you can't make that kind of an argument. They are not ready to receive that kind of argument. Actually, with very young children, they have a very difficult time with cognition and historical time, and so thinking about themselves as adults is sort of very difficult for them. So you can start to introduce it with them. With adolescents, you can start to talk about them in terms of self-interest, and that it's good for them, good for their family, good for the community, for them to follow the rule of law. They'll sort of follow that. But it isn't really until you get into high school where you can start to talk about high levels, reasonably high levels of moral reasoning. And so it is possible to do that if you've sort of done the baby steps before with introducing it earlier, talking about it when they're 10 and 11 before they've sort of started to commit themselves to various channels in life. And then if they are sort of with you a little bit longer and you can get them into high school, which isn't a big problem in the United States. In much of the world, it's very hard to keep children in high school. Most children don't go to high school, but in the United States, of course, most do go. They don't always stay, and they don't always pay attention in high school. But you can then start to appeal to their moral and legal reasoning. And this has been established as a principle of learning ever since the 1930s. I mean, we've had a cognitive psychological school which was able to actually demonstrate that they were able to reach children and improve their moral reasoning and the kinds of things you're talking about of honor and dignity and empathy and a whole syndrome of qualities that go together with moral and legal reasoning. So yes, but I would say you have to do this in steps. You can't just sort of go to there unless you have exceptions. But on a mass basis, one would want to start at an earlier point of self-interest, selfish interest, and then move to the altruistic and higher levels.
Dr. Godson, thank you very much.
Thank you.